When the Lutheran theologian Dr. Valentin André visited Geneva in 1610, he marveled that, quote, all cursing and swearing, gambling, luxury, strife, hatred and fraud, etc. are forbidden, while greater sins are hardly heard of.
This place is amazing.
He called Geneva a glorious ornament of the Christian religion, and a perfect institute of a perfect republic. Geneva had become this reformed Christian city through the leadership of John Calvin. Calvin first arrived in Geneva in 1536, but was exiled 2 years later due to political conflicts. See, there was a faction in power that sought to maintain an alliance with Bern, Switzerland, while Calvin opposed the church's subordination to a foreign state. The city's leaders refused to be lectured on foreign policy.
You want to sit up here and lecture us?
And since Calvin would not back down, he was expelled in 1538. He relocated to Strasbourg, 220 miles away. However, Geneva's political landscape shifted again, and a new ruling party, the Guillermins, rejected the alliance with Bern. They invited Calvin back in 1541, and he obliged.
I'll come back.
John Calvin then spent the rest of his life transforming Geneva into a reformed Christian city, in which social conditions were improved and morality was enforced through discipline. Upon his return, Calvin was tasked with drafting regulations for Geneva's church and a secular constitution for the Republic, shaping it into an independent state. His ecclesiastical ordinances established the Consistory, a governing body of 12 pastors and 12 lay councilmen who were responsible for addressing moral lapses among its citizens. The Consistory met every Thursday to hear new cases, confessions of sins, to hand out discipline, and ultimately to reintegrate the sinner back into the Christian community. Unlike civil courts, the consistory did not impose fines, jail sentences, or capital punishment. Instead, it issued 3 types of discipline: admonishment, exclusion from the Lord's Supper, and/or requiring public confession in church. For more severe cases, the consistory would hand over individuals over to Geneva's small council, which was the city's civil court. The consistory dealt with 3 broad categories of issues. The first were sins or unfitting behavior for the Christian, in which they sought repentance. These would include sexual sins like fornication and adultery, unfitting behaviors such as dancing and gambling, and sins that were against God, such as blasphemy. The second was weeding out superstitious and Roman Catholic practices, such as praying in Latin or to the Virgin Mary, celebrating Catholic holidays, possessing a rosary, or Catholic literature.
We're not Catholics.
The final category was seeking reconciliation and restoration of broken relationships. This would include offenses such as domestic abuse, as well as quarrels. To share a few examples, the coppersmith Hudri Langen confessed to saying blasphemous words. He first stood before the consistory, who denied him access to the Lord's Supper. And then he was sent to the small council, who sentenced him to 3 days in jail. In that, like many other examples, the consistory dealt with the soul and religious matters, while the state handed out physical punishments. This shows a cooperation that was between the church and the secular councils. Then there was Pernette Ray, who stood before the council admitting to fornication and confessing that she was pregnant. The consistory excluded her from the Lord's Supper, and the small council sentenced her to 6 days in jail. Even children were disciplined. In December 1558, a group of boys who skipped mandatory catechism to play the winter game Mark on Ice were sentenced to have corporal punishment meted out by their school teacher. The most infamous case regarded Michael Servetus, who was put to death in October 1553 by the Genevan court. Calvin has been painted, especially by opponents of Reformed theology, as responsible for the death of Servetus.
It's your fault he's dead!
And an example of what happens when one blurs the lines between church and state. Servetus, who was not a Genevan citizen, had already been condemned and sentenced to death for heresy in Vienne for his anti-Trinitarian views. Vienne was a part of the Kingdom of France and under Catholic rule. The consistory had him arrested upon his arrival in Geneva.
Place this man under arrest.
But immediately turned him over to the state council. Calvin, a trained lawyer and theologian, was called as an expert witness in his trial as a man capable of evaluating Servetus's theology. The Genevan court, not wishing to put to death their first heretic, allowed Servetus to be sent back to Vienne, but he refused.
I'm not going back.
Having no other option, the Genevan court also sentenced him to death and carried out the sentencing the very next day. It's important to note that Servetus had already been sentenced to death by another government, and it was not the consistory that sentenced him or carried out the punishment. Calvin's role in this matter was being part of the group that turned him over to the authorities and also as an expert witness in his trial. Discipline, though not exclusive to Reformed theology, was one of its emphasis. Lutherans only recognized two marks of a true church: the preaching of the word and the sacraments. Theologians such as Ulrich Zwingli as well as Heinrich Bullinger believed that all discipline resided with the magistrates alone, and both demonstrated a strong distaste for excommunication. However, Reformed leaders recognized a third mark of a true church: discipline. Though Calvin did not state this with words, he did through his actions, and then other Reformed leaders such as Martin Bucer and Calvin's successor Theodore Beza did so in words as well. Thus, the consistory was consistent with Reformed theology, and filled a religious void that was left by the removal of the Catholic practice of penance. The consistory was ultimately successful because its citizenship valued partaking in the Lord's Supper. See, communion was only celebrated 4 times a year in Geneva, so to miss it was a harder punishment than if it was celebrated more frequently. Since the consistory did not bear the sword, according to Romans 13:4, they could only succeed where a citizenship values its relationship to God through the Christian Church. There were some like Philibert Berthomir in 1551 who ignored the consistory, refusing to hear or accept judgment from them, but viewing themselves as only subject to the secular state. But he was an outlier, and the vast majority respected not only the authority of the state, but the authority of God through the church. Calvin viewed the office of deacon as those who were responsible for serving the social needs of the community. In his writing, Ecclesiastical Ordinances, he wrote that the deacons have the care of the poor and the sick and of the hospitals. He disliked the Catholic understanding that turned deacons into assistants to the priests in the Mass rather than helpers of the poor. Thus, in Calvin's Geneva, deacons were at the forefront of the social welfare plan. As a newly reformed city, Catholic places were repurposed, including turning the residence of the Catholic bishop into a public prison. The hospital, which had housed the convent of St. Clare, was taken over by the city, and the nuns were forced to either leave or turn Protestant. The hospital provided for the poor and housed many of them as well. Calvin, following the Apostle Paul's injunction that if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, so he ensured that the poor who lodged at the hospital had a craft, which led to the creation of the silk industry there. Schooling had been made mandatory in Geneva in 1536. As a part of this vision towards education, Calvin started the Geneva Academy in 1559. It was divided into a private school for elementary education and a public seminary for advanced studies. Now, despite them being called public and private, both schools were tuition-free. A large part of the Academy's goals was to have trained pastors for Reformed churches. He staffed it with the best teachers it had, and it actually lasts to this present day as the University of Geneva. Calvin did not believe that charity and social welfare were the pure responsibility of individuals, but was also a mandate of the state. Thus, he understood his job as Genevan pastor was to encourage the Genevan political authorities to redefine the role to include what we would now call social welfare programs. A final aspect to highlight was how Geneva became a safe haven for refugees, namely French Protestants. Calvin had his hand in starting a French fund to help provide for them as well as other poor people. He made use of the printing press to help fund it by the selling of copies of his sermons, as well as Theodore Beza's Psalms. Thus, Calvin helped Geneva improve in the relief of the poor of their own citizens, as well as refugees. He helped the poor have meaningful work through the silk industry, and saw that Genevans would be educated through the founding of the Genevan Academy. John Calvin is remembered as one of the leading figures of the Protestant Reformation. His legacy lives on through his theological writings, most notably his systematic theology called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Calvin was productive in Geneva, preaching daily and 3 times on Sunday, teaching weekly catechism classes, having theological debates, meetings of ministers, as well as the weekly consistory meetings. Thus, Calvin was the visible face and audible voice of authority in the city. In modern-day Christian circles, Geneva has become synonymous with Calvin and vice versa, due to his lasting impact that he made on the city. During the time of the Reformation, it became a safe haven for Protestant refugees that were fleeing persecution. It also became a model of other Reformed states of what a Christian city could look like. In the 1470s, Adam Steinschenberger, who worked under Johannes Gutenberg, set up a printing industry in Geneva, which was harnessed and used for disseminating Reformation literature. Thus, Geneva became the home of Calvinism, as both Calvin and other reformers works spread from the city through the world. Calvin's Reformation of Geneva has and continues to create polarizing responses. Some, like Dr. Valentin Andre, a Lutheran, was inspired by his visit there, calling it a glorious ornament of the Christian religion. Others, like the church historian Philip Schaff, concluded that Geneva looked more like, quote, old heathen Rome and the Levitical Code more than the gospel of Christ. And he also characterized much of the exercise of discipline as petty, pedantic, and unnecessarily severe. One modern apologist, Dave Hunt, published a book which has a self-explanatory title to portray his thoughts on Geneva, John Calvin's Tyrannical Kingdom. However, others saw the good behind what Calvin was doing. Jeffrey R. Watt, a historian who specializes in the Reformation era, eschewed all notions that Geneva was a Protestant version of the Inquisition, noting that the consistory was less a tribunal than a mandatory form of pastoral service, and that it generally preferred persuasion over persecution in effecting behavioral changes. He said that the ultimate goal of the consistory was to reintegrate the sinner back into the Christian community. See, justice can easily be mistaken for harshness, but it has the benefit of serving as a curtailer of worse kinds of harm. It also serves as a reminder and a warning to others who would attempt such destructive habits. The 21st century North American generally views unbridled freedom as a good goal and resists any form of curtailing sinful acts. However, a good government, according to the Apostle Paul, is one that is a terror to bad conduct, Romans 13:3, and that carries out God's wrath on wrongdoers, Romans 13:4. Good governments also encourage moral goodness in their citizens, that's verse 3. Geneva was not a perfect city, and doubtless there were many decisions that the consistory as well as the small council would have gotten wrong, as all governments and church bodies do today. But they did strive to have peace in relationships between their citizens, to curtail blasphemy, idolatry, and sinful practices, and also to serve and love the poor and refugees as themselves. In these ways, Geneva can be looked to as a model of what a Christian city could strive to be. Now, if you want to go deeper on this topic, the authoritative book is called The Consistory and Social Discipline in Calvin's Geneva, and it's written by Jeffrey Watt. Watt is the professor of history at the University of Mississippi, and his specialization is in European and Reformation history. The book is academic but readable, and I did consult it a lot in preparing for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Videos like this take a lot of research and work to put together, so if you wouldn't mind giving a like before you head out, that would be super helpful. Thanks so much.